A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms' Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. Glad to be with you today. We've got a very busy show for you. Coming up in just a matter of moments, we're going to talk with our friend Charles Cooke of National Review. A response to the New York Post front page editorial calling for a ban on quote-unquote assault weapons, as well as contained within that editorial, you had support for quote-unquote universal background checks and red flag laws and a host of other gun control measures. Now, you might say, listen, this is the New York Post. It's a New York City paper. Of course, they're going to be in favor of gun control laws. That is true. I think that you're likely right about that. I actually know several people who work for the New York Post who are very strong Second Amendment advocates. Unfortunately, they don't write editorials there at the New York Post. But it is also worth noting that you now have Republican donors, big dollar donors to politicians around the country saying, look, we've got to do something. We've got to adopt these gun control policies or else we're going to lose the suburbs in 2020. We're going to lose young voters in 2020. We don't have an answer to the gun control suggestions. And if it's not going to be gun control, then what is it going to be? This is something that we've talked about quite a bit here on Cam and Company. In fact, I mentioned yesterday that one of the things that I want to do over the course of the next week, 2, 3, 4, however long it takes, is to have these conversations about, look, I know that universal background check laws are not going to reduce violent crime, because I don't even think they're going to really be able to be enforced at the federal level, not without establishing some sort of federal gun registry, which is a whole other topic. And even then, I think its effectiveness is going to be limited because you're still going to be dealing with problems with compliance. Gun bans, I don't think, are the answer. Red flag laws, I've talked about the flaws that I've seen in the red flag legislation that has been introduced to date. But I also understand that the average American voter out there who's not a gun owner, who doesn't really care much about the Second Amendment because they don't exercise their Second Amendment rights, they are seeing these high-profile attacks take place in El Paso and Dayton at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. And their attitude is, well, we have to do something. And so what they're hearing that something is from a lot of politicians, from a lot of the media, from a lot of their favorite celebrities is, well, the something is gun control. I truly do believe that we as gun owners, it's not necessarily our job to come up with what works. It's our job to protect our rights. But we're at a point in time where we need to start having those conversations about, look, I don't think it's gun control. What do I think could be more effective? Well, here's what I think. So coming up later in the program, we're going to talk with a forensic psychiatrist named Dennis Petrocelli. He's from the Richmond, Virginia area. And we're going to talk about red flag laws. We're going to talk about the mental health aspect of mass shootings. And we're going to have, I think, more than one conversation with Dr. Petrocelli because these are lengthy, beefy topics. You know, I said something on Twitter over the weekend about we can have a serious conversation about quote unquote gun violence, but it's actually going to be like 4 serious conversations about suicide, about gang violence, about domestic violence, and about mass shootings. Those are the 4 biggest types of quote unquote gun violence that we have. Suicide by far, by the way, the largest type of violence involving a firearm. And suicide, I don't believe, is a gun control issue either. I think it's a mental health issue. But these, again, are going to be topics that require more than 5 minutes of conversation. And I worry that the attention span of the average American, and I will include myself in that statement, I worry that our attention spans are shrinking to the point where most of us aren't capable or interested in actually having a real conversation. That those soundbite solutions start looking better and better to distracted Americans who think about something for a couple of minutes and then move on. I don't think we make anything better. I don't think we fix anything if that's our attitude. It is going to take delving down into some of these issues. So we're going to do that today as well with Dr. Dennis Petrocelli. But right now, let's talk with our friend Charles C.W. Cooke of National Review about the push by the New York Post in particular, but certainly more broadly by many media outlets to ban the most commonly sold rifle in America today as a first step. Charles Cooke with National Review, thank you so much, sir, for coming on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
So, New York Post, big cover editorial yesterday calling for banning the most commonly sold rifle in America today, along with a whole host of other gun control laws. You had a masterful takedown at National Review, which I would encourage everybody to read. But when you first read that op-ed yesterday, what was your initial reaction upon seeing this talk about banning guns that are only used in mass shootings, for example?
Well, I was surprised by the whole thing. And in fact, it reminded me of a New York Times, not New York Post, editorial from a few years ago, where the New York Times said that for the second time in its history, it was putting an editorial on the front page. The other one, incidentally, was urging voters to vote against Warren Harding. So that didn't work out. But this is back in 2015. The New York Times put a really poorly reasoned argument on the front page proposing that the United States federal government adopt a ban on so-called assault weapons. And the New York Post seems to have looked at that and said, well, we'll do the same thing, right down to the total lack of detail and understanding and inclusion of cliches and non sequiturs and question begging and the rest. The thing that shocked me the most was the characterization of the AR-15 as being somehow totally different in structure and in law to any other gun, right down to the insistence that were the Supreme Court to look at the legality of the AR-15 on the in common use standard that was laid out in Heller, that it would find that it was not in common use because it was only used in mass shootings. That's an extraordinary thing to say. That's equivalent to saying that the Ford F-150 is only used in hit-and-run accidents. I'm sure there have been some hit-and-runs with Ford F-150s, but the Ford F-150 is the most commonly owned truck in the United States, and the AR-15 is the most commonly owned rifle in the United States. There's about 8 million of them in circulation. At a conservative estimate, there's about 20 million of them in circulation. On the higher end of the estimate, no one is quite sure. But what we are sure about is that they are owned by millions of Americans who use them for a variety of applications, day in, day out, without so much as thinking about hurting another person. This idea that they are only used by mass shooters is preposterous. And in fact, that assumption infects the rest of the editorial and the rest of the coverage in the issue of the paper.
Yeah, and we're used to seeing media that doesn't know a whole lot about how firearms work or even what gun laws are on the books, opining. It was disappointing for me to see it in a right of center publication like the New York Post, but I've also been disappointed by a lot of the politicians that are right of center this week who've been expressing support for things like red flag laws, things of that nature. It seems to me that they're hearing that cry to do something, and if you're a lawmaker, I guess the impulse is, well, I have to make a law. Right. And if you work in politics, if maybe you're an op-ed writer for the New York Post, that first impulse to do something is going to be, we have to change the law somehow. Do you think that there's any gun control law that you've heard proposed that you think would make a dramatic impact or even a minor impact on the individuals who are committing these mass shootings?
Not when it comes to mass shootings, no. Because the problem is in predicting and preventing an act that tends to be pre-planned, premeditated, the work of an obsessive. There is simply no way of knowing who is going to do this, where, and why. The vast majority of the proposals that we have seen are really proposals that have come out of our thinking about how to reduce crime. Now, I'm not in favor of many of them because I don't think that they would work. But I am at least happy to debate that on the merits. Where I think the political class and much of our media does us a disservice is in shoehorning those proposals, universal background checks is one such proposal, into our debate about mass shootings and pretending that it would serve as a panacea, that it would end up preventing this from happening in the future. That's a line you hear over and over again. We need to make sure this won't happen again. Well, universal background checks don't intersect with mass shootings. And they didn't affect this weekend's horrible news either way. And it hasn't affected any mass shooting in the last 10 years. And even if it had, which it hasn't, but even if it had, you'd have to be rather naive to think that the sort of person who obsesses over other mass shooters, who's determined to kill people, who spends his time planning attacks such as this, is going to be deterred by a law such as that in a country with 500 million guns in private hands. It's not going to happen. But I think the problem that we face was neatly summed up by the inadequacy of the Post's editorial, in that the editors have clearly been around enough conservatives to know that one of the objections that people who know a lot about guns often raise is that assault weapons bans, the federal one in 94, as well as some of the state level bans, and indeed the Dianne Feinstein proposals that have been made every year for the last 15, revolve around cosmetics. They revolve around parts of the gun that don't actually make it more or less lethal. The stocks, the part that goes up against your shoulder, flash suppressors and so forth, things that don't affect the working of the gun. And so they gesture at that. They say, well, we know that much of the proposed changes are cosmetic in nature. But then they say, well, instead of that, what we need to do is to look at things like rate of fire or muzzle velocity. But of course, the reason that assault weapons bans in the past and the proposed assault weapons bans that we've seen in the last few years are cosmetic in nature is that the difference between the AR-15 and the sorts of guns that the New York Post insists it doesn't want to ban are cosmetic in nature. You can't pass a law based on rate of fire for semi-automatic rifles without banning all semi-automatic weapons, because the rate of fire for an AR-15, being a semi-automatic weapon, is the same as the rate of fire for every other semi-automatic firearm that has been produced in the last century. Likewise, you can't go after muzzle velocity without affecting a huge number of rifles that are not on the ban list, not only for the New York Post, but even for some of the most extreme gun controllers. We always hear this in our politics. I don't want to go after your grandfather's hunting rifle. Well, good, but I've got news for you. The muzzle velocity of your grandfather's hunting rifle is pretty high because he's probably using it to shoot deer or elk or even bison. So you see once again that you can't get around these very real legal and structural problems purely by saying, well, do something. The devil is in the detail, and that detail hasn't changed.
So what do you think the something should be that needs to be done? Where would you start?
Well, I think, as I say, that it's very, very difficult to prevent mass shootings. I think we have a huge copycat problem now. I think insofar as we're going to make inroads in changing that, we're going to have to do so on a more individual basis. We're going to have to encourage interventions. We're going to have to teach people to look for warning signs. And I think we're also going to have to stop glorifying mass shooters, stop printing their names, stop putting 10, 15 days of wall-to-wall coverage around their actions. There's a lot of academic research that suggests that shooters are inspired by other shooters and that the media coverage does help encourage the next one. That's not to say we shouldn't talk about this, debate about this. Nothing is off limits. I don't want to silence anyone. I don't want to create some sort of censorship environment. But I do think we can be more responsible about the way that we treat people who do this. And then I think we ought to look at crime and suicide, which is by far and away the biggest problem we have when it comes to the misuse of guns in the United States. That's not to say that mass shootings don't matter. It's not to say that we should ignore them or not try to prevent them, of course. But it is to say that we don't properly prosecute straw purchases. The city of Chicago does not enforce its laws in the way that it should. And you see this low-level hum of everyday violence that tends to get ignored in favor of the more spectacular attacks that are much harder to prevent. So I would do what we can with mass shooters, but I think our priority should be trying to prevent the far, far greater numbers of firearms misuse that we're seeing in America, and hope that this copycat problem begins to diminish around the edges.
All right, now I want to ask you one more question about what we should do, and not from a public safety perspective, but from a purely political perspective. Because again, the New York Post, right of center paper, they're out there endorsing all kinds of gun control policies. I saw a story about a big Republican donor, a guy in the oil and gas industry who is freaked out that if Republicans don't start supporting gun bans and universal background checks and red flag laws and everything else, that the suburbs are going to be lost last year, the youth vote's going to be lost next year. What is your political advice on how Republicans should be addressing this issue? I don't think avoiding the issue is the answer, but what is your advice on how Republicans should approach this?
I just don't agree with that political calculation. And I should say this isn't how I think about American politics. I think about American politics first in terms of the Constitution, and then I think about what will work. So my opposition to most gun control is predicated both on a desire to preserve liberty and also on a considered belief that gun control is ineffective in the United States. But even if I were of the view that we needed more gun control, I would not buy into that political calculus. I think it's wrong. I heard it in 2013 ahead of the midterms. I heard it in 2015-16 ahead of the presidential election. I heard it here in Florida in 2018 ahead of the gubernatorial election and the Senate election. I think it is wrong. In terms of the youth vote, statistics show that young people are actually the cohort most likely to oppose a ban on assault weapons. It is true that suburban women often tend to be in favor of more gun control, but it's not as high a value issue for them as it is for many Americans who believe that the government coming in and passing strict gun control is a violation of their core liberties. And I think Republicans have become the party, by and large, of gun rights. And the Democratic Party has, by and large, moved away from supporting gun rights, especially this crop of presidential candidate. I think that the difference between the two parties is now more stark, and that there is probably more to be lost for Republicans by abandoning gun rights than there is to be gained.
Charles Cooke with National Review. It's always good talking with you, sir. I appreciate you joining me today. Hope we get a chance to do this again soon.
So great to talk to you.
You know, again, as Charles was saying, this is not just going to be related to the New York Post. Adam Kinzinger, who's a Republican from Wisconsin, out with a statement yesterday in which he is calling for the two sides in the gun violence debate to find a way to come together. Of course, gun control activists wouldn't have to give anything up. They'd get what they wanted, quote-unquote universal background checks, raising the age to purchase a firearm up to 21, banning some quote-unquote large-capacity magazines. Those are the things that Representative Kinzinger is calling for. And again, I think none of those things would be effective. I think the vast majority of those things would be really, really difficult to enforce. But lawmakers, when they're told that they need to do something, that means they need to make a law. That's what lawmakers do. They make laws. And if it's not going to be gun control laws, they need to be able to make something, right? So these quote unquote, he also came out in favor of these red flag laws, which again it's a soundbite solution. sounds really good in the 5 or 10 seconds it takes to explain it, but what does it actually accomplish? And at what cost? Not only to civil liberties, but also potentially to human life. I spoke with forensic psychiatrist Dr. Dennis Petrocelli about this very issue. And I would encourage you, I'll be honest with you, it's longer than a lot of interviews that you'll see on cable television. I think it's worth it. I think these subjects are important. You know, I worry again that we just don't have the attention span, myself included, to really get into the details of what it's going to take to save lives, what actually will work, as opposed to these knee-jerk, ban the guns, ban the magazines, pass the background checks, those knee-jerk reactions that are largely unenforceable, in many cases highly unconstitutional. Red flag laws have their own set of problems, but is there anything that that could be done to actually make it a workable system? That's part of the conversation we had. Check it out. We obviously are inundated right now with talking heads and pundits and everybody telling us, you know, look, here's what we need to do in order to stop these types of attacks from occurring. And right now, obviously, the big push is we need this gun control law or that gun control law. We hear vague talk about mental health. I'm curious. First of all, can you give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I'm a medical doctor that went on to specialize in psychiatry. I completed 6 years of postgraduate training in adult psychiatry, child psychiatry, and forensic psychiatry, the last of which has to do with performing evaluations of subjects to answer a legal question that comes up in court. And I've worked after that training for roughly 19 years. So all told, I'm in my 25th postgraduate year. And I like to think I have something to say about some of these things that these talking heads are talking about, sadly without any kind of scientific or training background.
Absolutely, which is one of the reasons why I'm so glad that you're here to talk about this. And by the way, I want folks to know, if they're watching, at the end of this interview, you and I probably will not have solved all of these conundrums, but hopefully maybe we'll be able to have a conversation, and maybe, you know, we'll be able to get one step closer or give somebody else an idea. Because the first thing that I think we need to talk about is that there is no simple answer. There's no one piece of legislation that anybody can write. There's no, you know, snapping of the thumbs that we can do, and all of a sudden this problem goes away.
Well, I think we have to first define the problem. And I think, unfortunately, what has happened is very horrific events occur. They are then sensationalized and then extrapolated from. And so I think the first step is deciding what it is that we want to solve. I think that if there are solutions to be had, solutions for example, suicides committed with firearms are likely to look very different than solutions to stopping people who kill large numbers of subjects with firearms. And so I think the construct of a gun violence epidemic is actually getting in the way of solving problems. We're more likely to have success if we could define a more circumspect aspect of a difficulty and target that with tools that make sense. And sadly, that's not what's happened so far.
No, you're right. I said yesterday that, in my opinion, we're looking at least 4 big factors here. You're looking at suicide, you're looking at violent crime or let's say gang violence, then you're looking at domestic violence, then you're looking at these, quote unquote, mass shooters. These are 4 very different conversations that you have to have if you want to talk about addressing each and every one of those problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to try and create one set of bills to address all of them really doesn't make any sense. Looking specifically at some of the states' so-called red flag laws or extreme risk protective orders or risk-based gun removal laws that go by different names, a lot of these were formulated in the wake of a mass killing. And in practice, what they've actually been brought to bear against is suicide. So the public thought it was doing something about stopping mass killing, but instead received a law that was applied to people that are suicidal. And what's shocking, if I can go into some of the details on that, one of the states that adopted this very early was Connecticut. And when that bill was looked at, it found at best, may be a marginal change in preventing suicide. Shockingly, among the people who had their firearms removed, over 20 in the time period looked at went on to commit suicide anyway. They found another way to do it. They then extrapolated using a very ad hoc, sketchy statistical method that for every 10 firearm removal episodes, it might be the case that one suicide was prevented. And one of the problems, and obviously preventing suicide is near and dear to my heart. I have no objection to that goal. But none of the, broadly speaking, medical people that are looking at this are really doing it from what I would call a public health perspective, meaning they're not taking into account what the negative side is of their interventions. If I had a drug that I wanted to bring to market, I would have to be very clear about what its risks are in order to get informed consent. I can't experiment on people. They need to know what they're getting into. These bills and the people behind them are not contemplating risks. In fact, one article that came from a very well-respected think tank here in Virginia actually put the phrase due process in quotes. So that shows the level of interest they have in upholding the Constitution. Never mind any of the other risks, which include death. Actually, implementing a red flag law could result in the death of the subject. People that are either doing a no-knock raid or coming early in the morning with guns drawn is a highly dangerous situation. And those risks aren't being contemplated.
You're right, because again, we have this very surface level conversation of, well, we need red flag laws, and we probably won't even define what those are, and we're certainly going to talk about how those will work. And we need it, right? And then we'll go from there. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned, that in Connecticut, what they found was that for every 10 of these interventions, perhaps one suicide was prevented. Obviously, as you say, there were other subjects who went on to commit suicide, even though they had been subject to one of these red flag firearm laws. And that's one of the issues that I have. We'll go back to the due process concerns, but I've said this several times that these red flag laws, as I've seen them written, look more like a gun control solution to a mental health problem. Because there's no actual, in most of these bills, there's no requirement that if someone is deemed to be a danger to themselves or other, that triggers some sort of, mental health intervention, or, hey, we're going to put you into therapy. Hey, here's this plan that we're going to work on so we can get you well. It's, nope, we're taking your guns and we're leaving you alone.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that was very eye-opening to me, I just attended a public forum in Petersburg, Virginia, put on by Representative McEachin. It had representatives of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence present. And that was very eye-opening. They made it very, very clear, because they are a large backer of a lot of these bills, that mental illness was specifically removed from the red flag bill equation. So it specifically was designed to not contemplate mental illness, but instead focus on risk. And that's why the red flag bills are almost uniformly devoid of language about treatment, because they aren't targeting mental illness. They're creating a class of human beings that are deemed to be at risk with varying approaches to determining that risk. The American Psychiatric Association has gone on record as saying that their general position is to reduce firearms access overall, meaning for all citizens of the United States, not just those that are mentally ill. They specifically note that should the red flags, have covered or specifically talked about mental illness, it would stigmatize the mentally ill unfairly. And so they pushed, as did these other groups, for language that had nothing to do with mental illness. And this is where we get into significant problems. The bill that's contemplated here in Virginia has nothing to say about treatment whatsoever. It merely takes the guns. This dangerous person is now left to their own devices to find some other way to either act violently toward themselves or others, which is simply horrifying. And yet these bills are cast as bills that are going to protect us. And one of the more shocking things is at that forum in Petersburg, Secretary Moran here in Virginia, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Public Safety, actually said that the bill requires that the person engage in a behavior that is deemed dangerous, and then they would become the subject of an investigation and proceedings. That's patently false. The bill says that the court is free to consider some of those behaviors, but none of them are required. So, in fact, what we're looking at here in Virginia is something that is entirely open-ended as to what the police and Commonwealth attorneys will discern to be indicative of a risk of violence.
You know, and I'm so glad that you brought up those details, Dr. Petrocelli, because, you know, again, we're told right now as gun owners, well, if you don't support these, then you want these attacks to happen. If you don't support these red flag laws, then you must want people to commit suicide. I'm pretty sure that's not the case with you. I know that's not the case with me. We want something, again, that's going to respect the rights of every individual, including those who are perhaps at risk. Right? Just because you are at risk doesn't mean that you lose your constitutional rights. Doesn't mean that due process becomes less important. We want something that is going to be legal, and we want something that is going to actually address the problem.
Correct.
Those are not unreasonable concerns.
They are not unreasonable concerns. Our country is founded on a set of liberties that were God-given, and the Bill of Rights is there to restrain the government from interfering with those. In anything that we do, when we lose sight of that, we go down a road that I think would lead to, for example, what happened in Venezuela. I'm sure the Venezuelans thought that they were doing good when they banned guns in 2012. I am certain in 2019, when the armored personnel carrier ran over civilians, they rethought that. We have to respect how we got to be the way we are and the rights that we have. At the same time, suicide is obviously something that we need to come together to try and prevent. The question is, do these bills actually do that? If the best we have in terms of data is coming from Connecticut, showing that although firearm suicide was reduced, but suicide using other means essentially balanced out those numbers, then what we have is what you said, a gun bill masquerading as a mental health bill that's not addressing the mental health issue. And I think that the devil really is in the details. I think, sadly, a lot of legislators are not even familiar intimately with the details of the bills that they're sponsoring or endorsing. Certainly, Representative Crenshaw surprised me by coming out in favor of red flag laws. I think that there's just a knowledge deficit there. I'd love to speak to him directly and try and go over what's in these things and see if there's a way we can go forward. But I think it's critical for everyone to understand that the people behind red flag laws specifically designed them to be apart from mental illness. So they're not addressing that. And I think when we try and graft due process into red flag bills and we try and graft mental health into red flag bills, we're going down the wrong road. We need to clearly delineate what the problem is we want to solve with legislation and then work specifically towards that. If we want to prevent suicide, then there might be things that we could do around mental health commitment laws. Every state has one form or another of mental health commitment law. Mm-hmm. And every state has a means of everyday civilians accessing that system on behalf of somebody else. Most people don't know how to do that. And certainly in a crisis, that's not the time to begin Googling how to do that. We need to get the word out. Certainly here in Virginia, anybody could go to a magistrate 24/7 and provide sworn testimony. I think this individual is a risk to themselves for these reasons. I'm aware that they have firearms. That magistrate could dispatch police to take the person, not the weapons, the person, to a place of evaluation and begin a process to determine whether or not they're at risk. In my view, if there is a firearms issue to be addressed, it should be addressed in the context of that mental health statute. In other words, once that person has been brought to a place of evaluation and deemed dangerous, at that point we can invoke something, if necessary, to then do something about firearms. But the focus has to be the person, not the weapon.
Listen, I think you are so spot on. And I feel really good, actually, because I was kind of laying out my thoughts last night. And we match up pretty closely. I agree with you. I think the starting point has to be the commitment laws.
Yes.
And then there's also, once that happens, and there's just one branch here, we're not talking about some sort of lowering of the standards to take some of your rights away. Right. You use the existing commitment laws, and then if there are firearms present, well, we can branch off, right? And we can talk about, okay, well, what do we do now here? Do we want to have this? And to me, it could actually be a better system than what we have right now, because right now what we have is, all right, if you're adjudicated mentally defective, you lose your rights forever. But what if this is an acute case? What if we feel like, well, this individual is in a crisis right now, but 3 months from now, 6 months from now, we don't think that's going to be the case. Maybe this could be an avenue of, instead of a, sort of a mental health felony, it becomes a mental health misdemeanor, right? We're not talking about the permanent loss of rights, but we are talking about during this critical time, perhaps as part of your mental health plan, no, your family keeps your firearms, or they're not with you. Maybe there are restrictions on your driving. Maybe but it can't just be gun oriented as well. You're right. It has to be about helping that individual.
That's right. If someone has an intention to do something, it is extraordinarily difficult to dissuade them until their life circumstances change. And so a focus on the weapons simply doesn't make any sense. If there is a motivation to obtain a weapon, it's going to be obtained, and our ability to prevent that is limited. I think it's far better to focus on the person, their treatment, and do something that's individualized. One of the things that I wonder about, obviously I'm a Virginia resident, I'm familiar with the laws here. I think some of the states that have much more restrictive firearms laws actually make it difficult to do the right thing. So I'm wondering if in California, if you're the subject of either a gun violence restraining order or a civil commitment and you possess firearms, I suspect it's not easy to then give those firearms to someone for safekeeping because of how the laws work there. And I think as a function of that, it actually makes people, make situations far more dangerous and ties the hands of everybody involved. So I think when thinking about gun laws, generally speaking, I think we have to look for unintended consequences that are extraordinarily negative. The resource documents put out by the American Psychiatric Association, the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy don't look at these things. Their general idea is if there's less gun access, we're making people safer. Completely ignores the estimated anywhere from 500,000 to 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year. And I could go on about that. But I think we have to focus on individuals, not the weapons.
I'm right there with you. Dr. Petrocelli, thank you so much for coming on the program today. We have really, I feel like, just begun to scratch the surface here. So I'm probably going to be asking you to come back on here in the next week or so. Is that all right?
Oh, that's absolutely perfect. There's so much more to say, and I'm happy to contribute what I can, knowing what I know about psychiatry and mental health and firearms.
Well, I appreciate you doing this. One of the things that I want to do here with Bearing Arms Cam and Company is not just talk about why gun control is not the answer, but maybe, again, try to root around and find our way towards other answers, as you say, things that actually are going to be effective at addressing these various issues. Dr. Dennis Petrocelli, thanks again for your time, sir, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Cam.
So I do appreciate Dr. Petrocelli. We're going to actually have Dr. Petrocelli back because I think there was a lot more that we could have discussed. We're getting kind of long there. I do understand. See, again, it's that short attention span theater that we all suffer from. There's only so much of this that we can take before our eyes start to kind of gloss over. So I want to keep things fresh. So we'll bring back Dr. Petrocelli at some point here in the very near future, maybe even later in the week. Right now, though, let's get to a couple of stories that indicate, again, gun control laws are not going to solve every problem. In fact, I don't think they're going to solve any problem. Case in point, Washington State, Seattle, Washington, where, homelessness, drug use, violent crime is on the rise. Here you go. Repeat offender accused of threatening a man in a wheelchair with a knife. And this guy, unfortunately, again, another individual well known to law enforcement, a 54-year-old man, his name's Thomas Kennedy. There was a gentleman in a wheelchair who was getting ready to cross the street in downtown Seattle. And Kennedy apparently walks up to him, kicks the victim in the leg. The victim pushes Kennedy back. Kennedy pulls out a knife. A police officer sees all this, by the way, and they had witnesses corroborating this as well. Pulls out a knife, threatens to kill the guy, and said he was defending himself. As it turns out, it looks like Kennedy's taken into custody. He's booked on charges. In fact, bail was denied for Kennedy, which is kind of rare. But here's the thing. Kennedy is no stranger to the law in Seattle, Washington. In fact, in April of this year, just a few months ago, one of his cases, carrying an unconcealed weapon, was dismissed due to his, quote, incompetency. So, you know, you've heard all these anti-gun politicians say, listen, it's not about mental health, it's not about mental health, it's about the gun. Well, here's a guy with a knife, not a gun. And here's a guy with some serious mental issues. Not a gun, but a knife and mental issues. Now, this is somebody who's not committed a mass shooting, but this individual, Thomas Kennedy, there are Thomas Kennedys in every city of the country. And every day, law enforcement are acting with individuals like Mr. Kennedy, and they're arresting them, and they're booking them, and prosecutors are looking at these cases and saying, this person's disturbed. They're going to get off. And then they go right back out onto the streets. There is no mental health available for them. There's no institutionalization. So this is a vicious cycle. And sadly, it's a cycle that often escalates until you really do have some serious violent activity associated with these individuals. There's no gun control law that you can put on the books that would stop Thomas Kennedy from doing what he did, or pulling out a knife again, or stabbing somebody. Gun control not going to help the Thomas Kennedys of the world. Fixing our mental health system, truly addressing our mental health crisis, that will help the Thomas Kennedys of the world. And that, by the way, will also help all the rest of us, because the Thomas Kennedys of the world won't be out there threatening to kill us time and time again. Our armed citizen story of the day from just down this road, I guess, from where I am in Farmville, Virginia, Amelia County, Virginia, where a couple ended up holding a home invasion suspect at gunpoint. This happened Saturday morning. A couple woke up to the sound of people in their home, people that should not have been there, and they yelled out, and they actually got a response. Yeah, they heard the dogs barking, and so they yelled, "Hey, who's there?" And somebody actually yelled back, "I'm here." Yeah, that's kind of a frightening thing when that happens. So the female homeowner handed her boyfriend a gun. He went to the top of the stairs and saw somebody down there. She ended up calling 911. Police arrived. They were able to take this guy into custody. No shots were fired like the vast majority of offensive gun uses. The trigger was not pulled, but this couple's still safe and sound. Turns out 2 people were actually arrested. There was a stolen car involved that had smashed into this couple in Amelia County's, one of the sheds on their property, and then apparently the pair made their way inside. They've both been taken into custody. The homeowners are okay, safe and sound, not facing any charges for defending themselves in their own home. But again, this is another case where these suspects already have previous criminal histories. They're not that old, but they are already known to law enforcement. They also did have a weapon on them because one of them is facing weapons charges as well. So the existing gun laws didn't seem to work. Don't think any new gun control laws would have worked. What did work in this particular case, the fact that this couple had a firearm to defend themselves, they had a phone to call police, and those 2 things allowed them to go about their day safe and sound while these suspects were in custody, thankfully. All right, that is going to do it for this edition of Cam & Company. Thank you so much for being a part of the program. Don't forget, check out BearingArms.com for all of the latest Second Amendment news and information. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. We are once again going to delve into not only why don't these gun control laws work to reduce mass shootings, to reduce gang violence, but what can we do that will actually respect the constitutional rights of Americans and be effective as well. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you tomorrow.